Tá mé har a bheith bhuíochtaí fasach an fíorcinn fáilte a dar se bhrúm hain is ma van céles na duine toitias to lum. I want to say how pleased I am to be here and thank you for that introduction and to be in the home of the trade union movement. It's my very great pleasure to have this occasion to honour the memory of Eva Gore Booth, and I'm particularly pleased to be able to do so here in Congress Hall, one of the emblematic seats of the cause of labour in Britain. As you have just heard, Eva Gore Booth, a rights campaigner and feminist, is, I believe, one of the most important figures for both of our peoples. And as I gave many lectures in commemoration over the last year, it struck me that this would be a very appropriate one to give here in London. The rights of workers, particularly those of women workers, was a cause to which Eva Gore Booth dedicated herself with energy, skill, and humanity. It was a cause to which she offered her writing and poetry, as you've just heard, as weapons of peace, but also her very considerable talent for organisation and that generous disposition for empathy and friendship which all those who knew her have described. The uncompromising ethical drives which distinguished Eva Gore Booth's work for social reform was unique, making her a major figure, as I have said, in the history of these islands. And as many of you will know, as we in Ireland have been commemorating this year the centenary of a milestone on our country's path to independence, the Easter Rising of 1916. These centenary celebrations, if I'm to think of what was with our best effect, it was perhaps the salvaging of the memory of some of those forgotten people, so many of them women, who carried forward Ireland's revolution and whose unyielding toil for emancipatory change has not always earned them the same recognition as that granted to rebel leaders. And in my speeches at commemorative state events then and at community events alike, I've been seeking to do justice in some small way to the role of women in the struggle for Irish freedom. And therefore it remained of immense importance to me that adequate tribute be paid to Eva Gore Booth as a remarkable, indeed quite extraordinary figure, not just in Ireland's revolution, but also in the international trade union, suffrage and peace movements of the last century, and yet one whose memory has been somewhat obscured in orthodox Irish historiography. As Professor Mary Condren, Professor of Women's Studies at Trinity College Dublin, put it, when the history of those times were written, Eva Gore Booth herself was relegated to being a mere afterthought to her more famous sibling. For Irish school children, her sister was the role model, Constance Markievicz, the sole woman to appear complete with military weapons in the iconography of the Irish Revolution. So may I once again then say how much I welcome this opportunity this evening to pay tribute to the life and achievements of Eva Gore Booth here in Britain, and with this particular audience in this particular place for whom her life would have such significance. It is not just the occasion to redress the oblivion of history that I welcome. More importantly, perhaps it seems to me, that all of us can draw inspiration from Eva Gore Booth's integrated emancipatory instinct, from her unswerving commitment to the rights of the powerless and the disenfranchised. And we can too recoup much needed courage and confidence in the knowledge that Eva Gore Booth fought many battles against the dominant and distorting discourse of the established powers of the day. Battles which we know now were pioneering, although she did not live to see most of them triumph. An important point for today, I think, was her ability to respect and accommodate the views of other radicals, which was in its eschewing of any suggestion of sectarianism, exemplary and of value for us today. Indeed, Eva Gore Booth was a true revolutionary who transgressed the boundaries of her time, sex, and class, born into the Anglo-Irish landed class, and even if into one of its rare progressive parts in the west of Ireland, she became a trade union founder and went to live with her lifelong partner, Esther Roper, in a working-class neighbourhood of Manchester. She was an ardent campaigner for women's suffrage and for gender equality in an age still ruled by patriarchal values, not wholly gone. She was a prominent advocate of pacifism and a supporter of conscientious objectors throughout the heightened militarism of World War I. And as we all know, she was an Irish nationalist, one of the daughters of a long line of landlords who yet embraced the cause of Irish independence. It is those various strands of Eva Gore Booth's life, a life lived in the public world, in the service of the public good, which I want to explore this evening. In doing so, I am deeply indebted to the work of Sonia Tiernan, who produced in 2012 the first biography dedicated entirely to Eva Gore Booth, under the title Eva Gore Booth, An Image of Such Politics, as well as an excellent edition of Gore Booth's political writings published last year by Manchester University Press. Many of those writings gathered there were out of print and scattered across a variety of archival collections, brought together by Dr. Tiernan. I think perhaps the title of her book, Eva Gore Booth, An Image of Such Politics, is probably taken from William Butler Yeats' acerbic and somewhat unfair and unworthy poem in memory of Eva Gore Booth and Constance Markievicz. The light of evening Lissadell, great windows open to the south, two girls in silk kimonos, both beautiful, one a gazelle, but a raving autumn shears blossom from the summer's wreath. The older is condemned to death, pardoned, drags out lonely years, conspiring among the ignorant. I know not what the younger dreams, some vague utopia, and she seems, when withered old and skeleton gaunt, an image of such politics. I think, in a way, I would need an entire evening to discuss where this fits and how I could deconstruct it properly in terms of Yeats's work. His temperament at the time of writing this explains very much more. But Eva Gore Booth's work comprises poems, drama, journal articles, essays in philosophical prose, letters published by the newspapers of the day, most often the Manchester Guardian, as well as penny pamphlets published by radical organisations. Gathered as they have been, as I said, by Dr. Tiernan, those writings provide invaluable insight into the work of Eva Gore Booth as a trade unionist, radical suffragist, pacifist, nationalist, and prison reformer. A defining event in Eva Gore Booth's path to activism was, of course, her encounter with Esther Roper, whom she met in 1896 while recovering from illness in Italy. Their friendship was instant, deep, and in Eva's case, spiritual. The two women would go on to share a house and work together over the subsequent 3 decades. Indeed, they hardly ever spent any time apart from one another, until Eva's death in 1926. According to Sonia Tiernan, this lifelong companionship between the two women, described by some of their contemporaries as a pair of oddities, may be one reason why Eva's name has been overlooked in Irish popular memory. And I was very concerned at this exclusion of Eva Gore Booth from the accounts we've had of the period. Who was Esther Roper then? Well, Esther Roper was herself a remarkable woman and a distinguished activist. Both her parents were from a working class background, and Esther was named after an aunt who had worked as a cotton weaver from the age of 12. Her father, who had been a missionary in West Africa, died when Esther was 9 years old. Her mother was the daughter of Irish immigrants and an advocate of female education, who encouraged Esther to enter Manchester's Owens College, where the young woman became one of the first female students to receive a BA degree in 1891. Aged only 20 when her mother died, Esther took responsibility for her younger brother Reginald, and she rapidly found employment as secretary of the Manchester National Society for Women's Suffrage, and began campaigning for the enfranchisement of all women, regardless of whether or not they owned property. A very good point to remember, of course, is that even though women had participated, for example, in the Irish Rising and so forth, it's quite some time before you get, indeed, it would be one of the campaigns that Constance Markievicz would raise was about the property qualification and the right to vote of all women, including those under 41. I think when she began, Esther Roper became involved with the Manchester University settlement, about which a word later, which encouraged university staff and past students to provide classes and cultural activities for those with little or no access to education. The settlement's roundhouse in the area of Ancoats thus became a thriving place, a common ground on which men and women of various classes would meet in goodwill and friendship and learn from each other. A year after their encounter in Italy, Eva Gore Booth went to live with Esther Roper in a terraced red brick house in Manchester. Yes, the Gore Booth family had connections and property in Manchester, and her cousin lived there, which Eva chose to ignore, preferring to share the house with Esther's brother and a couple whom they took in as lodgers. Manchester was then a city which concentrated the very quintessence of British industrial life. Interpreting Manchester, what sense were we to make of Manchester? Manchester would become a major collision of ideologies in terms of interpretation. How was the Industrial Revolution to be interpreted? This is a theme with which I engaged myself some years ago when I was studying in Manchester. Manchester was to some a shining citadel for the future. It needed a town hall worthy of the great success of the industrial system. And indeed, an appropriate history was commissioned by the leading citizens of the time. And I think for others, it was a devouring minotaur of human life and experience. And in 1977, my late friend and professor of sociology at Manchester University, Valder Pons, presented a paper at Stanford University with which I assisted him, in which we analysed the responses of British writers to this phenomenon, this Manchester, what was it, in the period from the 1830s and 40s. Of course, the people who wrote about this Manchester included Friedrich Engels, J.P. Kay, W. Cook Taylor, and others, who were all, if you like, even if it were from different perspectives, responding to what was the newness, the enormity, and the dynamism of Manchester at the turn of the 19th century. Professor Pons showed how Manchester's status as it was described as a new, unique element in British society, a factory town, was the object of differing interpretations, informed by different assumptions about the city and the wider society. These range from those who viewed the forces of radical change that were being unleashed by industrial capitalism as an opportunity to, quote, release potential man in a classless society, to those, on the other hand, who, alarmed by the evils of urban life, emphasized the value of charity and philanthropy. And that was a philanthropy which influenced, too, the work of the Manchester University settlement. The work we sought at that time and the framework developed by Valder Pons in his lecture in Stanford is a useful one to understand the divisions which traverse both the suffrage and labour movements in Eva Gore Booth's time. Divisions which set apart those like Eva and Esther, who advocated for radical social and political reform, and those others who, progressive as they would claim, were driven by middle-class moralism. May I also recall how the Manchester of the late 19th century was home, as many of you will know, to tens of thousands of Irish people, some of whom hailed from Eva Gore Booth's home county in Ireland. Many had reached Liverpool on board the steamship which in the decades following the Great Irish Famine departed Sligo Bay weekly, and they had then travelled the 30 miles to Manchester, where employment was found in abundance. It gives you an idea of the numbers of the Irish. That Liverpool had 286,000 Irish in 1846, 300,000 in 1847, and in a 9-day period between the 18th of January and the 26th of January 1847, altogether, the number of people who were relieved from poverty was 190,000. By the early 1860s, more than 800,000 Irish people were living in England, of which almost half were concentrated in Lancashire and Cheshire. Now, Friedrich Engels has, in his writings, given us detailed and somewhat unsympathetic accounts of life in the ghettos of Manchester's new town, known as the Irish Town, where people survived in squalid conditions. I think it is worthy of noting that factory owners, in pursuit of status and titles, saw landed settings as their best opportunity and did not live, except with very few rare exceptions, near the factories that produced their wealth. And indeed, Kay, in Cook Taylor's writings, sought to draw, occasionally you would see people asking these industrialists to go back and look at where their factories were and the experience of those who were living near them. To make matters worse, of course, for the Irish, it was feared would spread disease and work for lesser wages than their fellow English workers, where they were often viewed with hostility and fear. Understanding the world of these migrants and their origin was not to be an achievement of Engels, I believe. But Eva Gore Booth had witnessed, if you like, the recurrence of the famine, which had revisited Ireland and Sligo in the years 1879 to 80. Then 10 years old, she had alongside her siblings been involved in the distribution of her family's food stocks to tenants in need. And indeed it is worth noting what makes the Gore Booths perhaps exceptional is that her brother is one of those who reduces the rents of the tenants in this period. And deeply aware she was of the conditions from which those Irish migrants had fled, she was appalled by the environment that they were now encountering in Manchester. So Eva Gore Booth threw herself into social reform work among the very poor and densely populated working class district of Ancoats, where 40% of the population were Irish. She was also drawn to the work, as I have said, of the university settlement, setting up a dramatic society with women textile factory workers and organising dramatic evenings every Monday. In 1900, she was appointed as co-secretary of the Manchester and Salford Women's Trade Union Council, which had been established a few years earlier in an attempt to bring trade unionism within the reach of scattered individuals working in the unorganised trades. Under the leadership of its two secretaries, Eva Gore Booth and Sarah Dickinson, the WTUC helped to form trade unions for women, primarily for cotton operatives and weavers, but the formation of the Women's Trade Union Council was also a response to the reluctance shown by male-dominated unions to openly welcome female membership and take care of the specific issues faced by women workers. Some unions, such as, for example, the Bookbinders Union, would not allow women to become apprentices. As for the Manchester and Salford Trades Council, many of its members feared the undercutting effect of women's low wages. Indeed, its president of the day had publicly expressed the view that the proper place for women was not in the workshop, but at home. Eva Gore Booth vehemently combated such views, advocating for women's financial independence in numerous speeches, letters, and pamphlets. If I may quote her words, which poignantly evoke not just the life of women of the previous century, but also the daily reality of so many women in our contemporary world. She wrote, "There is no poverty so crushing as the poverty of a family, where through force of circumstances, as indeed often happens, a woman is the principal breadwinner. The theory that working men keep their families and that the earning of women are merely an extra help to the family finances has often been quoted as a justification for the low wages of women, but it has grown to be wholly untrue to the facts of life. Directly a girl is grown up, or indeed long before the age that is considered full grown up amongst people who have leisure to grow up comfortably, she is expected to earn her keep. So many young children and old people are, of course, dependent on married women, and there is not a working woman in the country, married or single, who does not know that, probably for one reason or another. She will, before the end, be thrown on her own resources, and that there comes a time in most people's lives when only their capacity for wage earning stands between them and the workhouse. And indeed, the Gore Booth family would be very familiar with the operation of the workhouses, which we must remember, of course, is that before the famine itself, of 1845, 6, 7, would not take people who were suffering. There were 50% occupancy, and of course, these conditions were appalling. In those years that she spent living in Manchester, Eva Gore Booth dedicated herself also to combating attempts at restricting women's employment. Working women, especially married ones, were viewed with suspicion at the turn of the 20th century. In 1905, a year when infant mortality rates had reached alarming heights in Britain and Ireland, and were at their highest actually in Dublin City, married women working in factories became the object of a stringently critical public campaign, including comments from some in liberal circles. For example, socialist and trade union activist John Burns had thus described how, quote, if mothers were working for 9, 10 or 12 hours in a factory, it not only contributed to producing a high mortality among their infants, but the effect on the children who survived was seen in gangs of anemic, saucy, vulgar, ignorant, cigarette-smoking hooligans. Eva Gore Booth was incensed by John Burns' suggestion that married women who were working were the source of but not only infantile deaths, but of Britain's social problems and antisocial attitudes. And she publicly questioned Burns' notion that, I quote, the ideal woman of the working class is clean, sober, dependent, and has a talent for cookery. She argued for radical social reform as the only viable path, including the creation of creches with trained attendants, real projects for street and house sanitation, and a better food supply. Just think of how advanced these views are in some places, even by today's standards. In these years, Eva Gore Booth also led a series of campaigns against legislative proposals aimed at limiting the access of women to certain categories of employment, portrayed as harmful to their health and morals. In 1908, for example, Eva Gore Booth organised the Barmaids Political Defence League to oppose the inclusion in the licensing bill of a section prohibiting women from working in licensed premises. Note that it was not the clients of the licensed premises who were a source of the immorality, but rather the women who would serve them drinks. The proponents of the ban, in particular temperance suffragists, who viewed the bill as protecting women from a path of moral ruin, were portrayed by Gore Booth as short-sighted philanthropists. When I was writing about some of this many years ago at Manchester University and preparing lectures on urban sociology, I was quite struck by the anti-urban bias in the literature, at both sides of the Atlantic. A typical view, I think, of that would be representative would be that of Josiah Strong, who said, God created man in a garden. The city is the result of the fall. And thus, in the American literature of the period, you would have descriptions about how gambling and sexual depravity and so on were the results of the city. And this would become a theme that would be replied to, I think, very forcefully in Raymond Williams' work, City and Country, in chapter 2, where he speaks about pseudo-pastoralism. Unexpectedly, Eva's vibrant barmaids campaign claimed Winston Churchill as its main political casualty. During a whole day and part of the night before the election in 1908, Constance Markievicz, who had rushed to the assistance of her sister, memorably drove a striking coach pulled by 4 white horses around the streets of Manchester, while Eva took to the roof of the coach and made a rousing speech about barmaids as Churchill was holding his own meeting at the Coal Exchange. Not only did the campaign cost Churchill his seat as MP for Manchester North West, it also convinced Prime Minister Asquith to remove the entire section relating to women from the licensing bill. It is important to state that Eva Gore Booth was not hostile to legislative proposals aimed at protecting workers or women workers. She was opposed rather to those sections in the Factory Acts which threatened the lives of women by setting regulations that applied to them alone. She argued if there were to be restrictions and protections, they must apply to men as well, thus ensuring that competition for jobs would be equal. These views were clearly outlined in a speech in which Eva Gore Booth expressed her support to 2 other groups of vulnerable working women, namely pit-brow workers and women engaged in dangerous performances. If I may quote from Sonia Tiernan's dealing with this subject in her work, the Miners' Federation, horrified at the increase of female labour at the pit-brow, does not appeal to Parliament to protect the men's work, but they appeal on sentimental grounds that the women should be protected against the moral deterioration of the miners' conversation and the strain of hard work. The self-condemnation in the miners' first protest surely needs no comment, and there is something absurd in making the law to protect the women from the society of their own relations and friends. Mr. Gladstone also proposed to legislate against the employment of women in dangerous performances. Are then all the women circus performers, high divers, gymnasts, bicycle performers and acrobats to be turned out of their work because one woman is killed by an accident with a parachute, an accident caused by a fault in the machine, not the performer? This is no sex question. If Mr. Gladstone's purpose is to protect the woman's life against her will, surely the man's life is of some account too. The laws of gravity apply to men and women alike. Eva Gore Booth's campaign in support of pit-brow workers and women performers also manifests a radical conception of gender equality. Indeed, both Gore Booth and Roper were pioneering not just in their opposition to any kind of discrimination based on gender in the workplace, but in their view of gender, in their view of gender performance as simply learned behavior and convention. As a sociologist, I find this very interesting. Eva Gore Booth, whose health was notoriously delicate, went so far as to work at the pit-brow as a pit-brow lass to prove that there was no physical limitation to women's work. 1911, the year of the pit-brow campaign, was also the year when Eva and Esther joined Thomas Batty's ethnic union, which claimed that upon the fact of sex there has been built up a gigantic superstructure of artificial convention which urgently needs to be swept away. Together with other members of the ethnic union, they established the journal Urania, to which reference has already been made, in which one can find articulated their view that sex was an accident and formed no essential part of an individual's nature. These indeed are words which are uncannily similar to those that would be formulated half a century later by Simone de Beauvoir. Another remarkable feature of Eva Gore Booth's social and political activism is her connecting of industrial struggles and women's trade unionism with the political battle for women's suffrage. She was convinced that the position of women, both in the home and in the workplace, would not improve until they had received the franchise. In other words, there was, in Gore Booth's view, an intrinsic link between women's political disability, their exclusion from the responsibilities of national life, and the low wages which were the plight of working women. As she put it, 6 or 7 shillings a week is not a sufficient sum of money to live on. This is not the rate of wages that could possibly be enforced upon the enfranchised citizens of a free country. We feel that our industrial status is being brought down. It results from the fact that we have no political power. While such connection between industrial and political issues might seem obvious to some of us today, this was far from true in Eva Gore Booth's time. The suffrage movement was traversed by similar divisions and conflicts as the trade union movement was, to which I've already referred. Eva Gore Booth and Esther Roper were among the first to take the issue of women's suffrage out of the preserve of middle-class concerns and to seek the enfranchisement of all women, regardless of their property qualifications. Eva Gore Booth had, in 1899, joined the executive committee of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, an umbrella organisation established to coordinate the work of Britain's 500 or so suffrage organisations. However, Eva Gore Booth's position was on the radical side, more radical than that of the Union, which campaigned to secure votes for women on the same terms as successive Reform Acts had granted them to men, who satisfied certain property qualifications. Extending the vote to women on such terms would, of course, do little to improve the lives of working-class women, few of whom owned or rented property in their own right. As Eva Gore Booth's friend Selina Cooper put it in a speech summing up the position of their group of radical suffragettes, women do not want their political power so as to boast they are on equal terms with men. They want to use it for the same purpose as men, to get better conditions. Convinced that there was no resolution but political to the plight of millions of women employed in what were miserably paid trades, such as folding and sewing, cigar making, cap making, fancy box making, if not in outright sweated labour, Eva, Esther and their friends launched in 1900 a large petition for suffrage, presented to the Lancashire MPs by Sarah Reddish, who had worked in the cotton mill factories from the age of 11. This was the first petition of working women ever presented to the British Parliament. Eva Gore Booth described how deputations of enthusiastic workers arrived at the House of Commons and could not believe in the indifference of the well-to-do world to the claims of the unenfranchised wage earners. The deputations came back to Lancashire sadder and wiser women. The women then looked to the recently formed Labour Representation Committee, the LRC, which had demanded representation for working men in the House of Commons as perhaps their best chance of gaining the franchise for women. The issue of women's political representation was not, however, a consensual one amongst members of the Labour Representation Committee. This seemed all the more outrageous to the women of the textile trade unions to which the LRC was affiliated, because after all, there was a majority of female members who were paying the same parliamentary levy as men. Disappointed by the LRC, Eva Gore Booth and Esther Roper formed a group to sponsor a candidate pledged to universal women's suffrage in the 1904 election. The Lancashire and Cheshire Women, Textile and Other Workers Representation Committee. The writings of Eva Gore Booth on behalf of the Women Workers Representation Committee are ones that powerfully speak to us today. In them we see how deep her rejection was of any form of aristocracy, not just of the old hereditary aristocracy from which she had departed and which she had rejected, but also of what she called the new aristocracy of labour, living in the illusion that it could protect itself from the multitude of helpless, outlawed, unorganised and half-starved workers. These, of course, are issues that continue to challenge us today, all of us in our own times, and not just within our respective countries, but also as an indication of what response is needed to the urgent challenge of reorganising the labour movement at global level. For Eva Gore Booth, there was no doubt that the cause of labour had to be the cause of the most vulnerable, that the chain of working people was never stronger than its very weakest link. And if I may quote from the manifesto of that group, the Lancashire and Cheshire Women Workers Representation Committee, The government says we have nothing to do with you. You can bring no pressure to bear on us. But the union says we feel the pressure of your poverty, in spite of the deafness of the political parties to human needs. Working men everywhere are beginning to realize that the exclusion from all political rights of a body of 5 million women workers is not only a source of industrial weakness and poverty to themselves, but a danger to the whole of the world of labouring people. Eva Gore Booth was thus acutely aware that working women's political disability made them an easy target for politicians during times of increased economic struggle. Had she lived amongst us today, I have no doubt that she would have been a voice for those new disenfranchised, those whom we call strangers, migrants, and migrant women, who are in our time so easily blamed for providing cheap labour and for a whole range of other problems by the ignorant and those who sponsor hate. As Eva Gore Booth said, what the working class needs is not protection from one another, but protection from the evils of poverty. These are words that resonate so profoundly with our contemporary situation, and words that can illuminate our continuing struggle for decent work for all. We can also find inspiration, I believe, in another strand of Eva Gore Booth's public work, namely her passionate commitment to the cause of peace throughout the years of World War I. In 1913, Eva Gore Booth and Esther Roper moved to 33 Fitzroy Square, just a few streets from here. The lower floors of their house harbored Roger Fry's Omega workshop, and the two women soon began to mix with a so-called Bloomsbury group that included such people as John Maynard Keynes, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey, Vanessa Bell, who were challenging accepted views on economy, sexuality, and patriotism, who were celebrating life in all its diversity and possibilities and freedom. The outbreak of the First World War in September 1914 caused most suffragist organizations to suspend their campaigns for women's enfranchisement and join forces with the government in support of the British war effort. In contrast, while continuing her campaign for women's suffrage, Eva Gore Booth spent most of those years working for the cause of peace. Impervious to the patriotic fever which held sway in the country, she supported those German citizens who had found themselves trapped in England by the outbreak of the war. She also participated in writing a collective letter signed by 101 British and Irish pacifist women, which was sent to German and Austrian women at Christmas 1914, and to which those women in turn responded in the same spirit of peace and friendship. So Eva Gore Booth went on to be relentless in her denunciation of war as a destruction of everything that is of value to human life. As I think of what she wrote at this time, I think of Syria and its people as I read her speech delivered to the National Industrial and Professional Women's Suffrage Society in December of 1914, when she said, "We read in the papers every day of thousands of brave people of all countries shot dead or mutilated for life. We hear terrible tales of hardship, of the cold and wet, of the unbearable filth of the trenches. Then we hear of a devastated country, town bombarded, villages burned, crops destroyed, and thousands of people face to face with all the miseries of famine and homelessness. In our country, we're surrounded by mourners, by people who've lost all that made life worth living, whose nearest and dearest are lying dead among the unspeakable horrors of what is called the fields of honor. Instances of heroism and self-sacrifice shown by soldiers on all sides have been quoted as a justification for war. But it only adds a little to the general tragedy to think that such fine qualities should be lost to the world, and lives that might have been so useful swept away in the universal and intolerable carnage." Words of such relevance today. Eva Gore Booth was relentless too in her denunciation, again relevant to today, to the failures of international diplomacy. Describing with words which must cause us all to pause and reflect, she said, We have surely reached the logical result of some wrong doctrine when we find the governments of 10 civilized nations forsaking their proper functions of caring for the welfare and happiness of the governed and straining every resource of science and knowledge to cause so much pain on as big a scale as possible. And as the war went on, although deeply disturbed by the sinking of the Lusitania, for Eva Gore Booth was shocked to learn that among the 1,200 people who lost their lives was Hugh Lane, a nephew of Lady Gregory, who had been engaged to one of Gore Booth's closest friends and who patronized young Irish artists such as Jack B. Yeats and William Orphan. So as the war went on then, Eva Gore Booth turned her efforts to the anti-conscription movement. For in July 1915, she attended the Pacifist Philosophy of Life conference in Caxton Hall, where she befriended Finner Brockway, editor of The Labour Leader, who published an appeal for conscientious objectors and established the No Conscription Fellowship. The fellowship offered protection for young men who refused to take up arms on moral, religious, or political grounds. For Gore Booth immediately got involved with the fellowship's campaign, passionately defending man's right to his own soul and conscience. By the end of the year 1915, the huge losses suffered by armies on all sides meant that the men killed or wounded on the front were not being replaced. On the 2nd of March 1916, for the first time in history, military conscription was introduced in Britain. The Military Service Act 1916 did indeed contain a section allowing for individual exemptions due to conscientious objection. However, the process for gaining such exemptions proved particularly difficult, even stigmatizing for those who applied. I think at that time it was decided there were 2 million people, young men, who did not apply or did not register. And the issue then became, how are their cases to be tried? And these were mostly working class young men, and those who in fact decided their cases were from the middle classes with little experience of what working class conditions were. Like hundreds of other volunteers, Eva Gore Booth travelled across England to attend the work of the tribunals that were established to hear cases of conscientious objection. She dramatized a day in the life of a watcher, that is someone attending the tribunal, in an emotional account called The Tribunal, which provides a rare glimpse into the experience of those seeking an exemption from war service. One cannot but admire the courage of Eva Gore Booth in writing against militarism, campaigning against militarism at the height of intense pro-war propaganda, and in bravely identifying herself as the author of texts such as the pamphlet she produced. During the same time, Bertrand Russell, with whom she had become acquainted at the Caxton Hall conference, had been arrested for writing a similar pamphlet and dismissed from his lectureship post at Trinity College, Cambridge. Indeed, to dissent from Britain's war fever was perhaps the hardest and most vital act of moral courage any citizen could undertake at that time, and it was particularly difficult for women to appear what was called ungrateful, as it would be put, towards the men that were exposing themselves to mutilation and death. While Eva Gore Booth was immersed in the peace campaign in Britain, the wheels were in motion in Ireland for an armed uprising against British imperial rule. Eva was unaware that her own sister, Constance Markievicz, was centrally involved in preparing the military strike which broke out in Dublin during Easter week 1916. This, Dr. Tiernan, Dr. Sonia Tiernan describes, is perhaps surprising, considering the very close bonds which united the two sisters, who regularly visited and wrote to each other. During their childhood, spent on that big estate in Lissadell in County Sligo, the two had a deep friendship which was sustained through both of their lives. Constance often illustrated her younger sister's poetry with watercolour paintings of her drawings, a collaboration which they resumed during Constance's imprisonment in 1916. And during that time, when Eva visits Constance and she asks her about the conditions in which she's being held, and Constance tells her, you should go to Mrs. Mallon. She has a house full of children. And in turn, she does that. And then she joins up with Hannah Sheehy Skeffington in gathering money so that the Mallon family will not starve. Eva and Constance, both of whom had been presented at the court of Queen Victoria in 1887, both of whom rejected privilege of their upbringing and social circumstances. But at a time of great change and political agitation in Ireland, when campaigns for tenants' rights were challenging the position of landlords, both sisters chose to put their lives in the service of the oppressed. They were driven by the same idealism, although they chose very different paths to achieve their ends. R.M. Fox, a friend of Eva Gore Booth who had visited her shortly before her death, thus described the common passion for justice which united the two sisters, which animated their different actions. The gap dividing the sisters is much smaller than many realize, though they seem to be at opposite poles. Both were rebels against all that they regarded as mean and unworthy. Their passionate, selfless sincerity drove them in different directions. One came out of the smoke and flame and handed her revolver to the commanding officer when the rebels surrendered. The other was a militant pacifist. A pacifist at heart, Eva Gore Booth nevertheless steadfastly defended in her writings and speeches the reputation and motivations of her friends who were involved in the Easter Rising. And while Eva Gore Booth is too rarely acknowledged as an Irish patriot, her commitment to the cause of Irish freedom, in fact, predates the 1916 revolution. In her early poetry, we can see already how Eva's inspiration was Republican in the French sense, and in the deepest sense of that meaning, that word Republican, and revolutionary, based on the ideals of the French Revolution, as I've said, and Wolfe Tone's non-sectarian principles. She was also an intrinsic part of the Irish cultural revival movement, the friends of such as George Russell, A.E., and William Butler Yeats, whom she knew from her teen years in Sligo, and who had written encouragingly of her poetry. I did like to think that Yeats was unaware of Eva Gore Booth's deep illness just before her death. But in fact, as the ambassador and I discussing it, in fact, the time he wrote the poem, he must have been well aware of the circumstances of both her illness and her death, and that is why I regard that section of that poem as somewhat unworthy. Throughout her life, Eva Gore Booth published numerous volumes of poetry, also plays, inspired by Ireland's ancient mythological figures. She's a very interesting change, for example, on the Cuchulainn myth. Most notably as well, she drew on Maeve, Queen of Connacht, whose burial ground, Knocknarea, who that cairn overlooks the castle in which they lived at Lissadare. When the Rising broke out in 1916, Eva Gore Booth interpreted it not as an act of war, but as an act of rebellion against British oppression. And this is manifest, for example, in what she wrote, Rhythms of Art, a pamphlet that she wrote for the League of Peace and Freedom. And this is what she wrote. The Dark Rosaline is a far more beautiful poem than Rule Britannia, because the rhythm that finds vent in rebellion, imperfect as it must be, or else it could not find vent in violence, is still a more subtle and beautiful rhythm than the vibration that expresses itself in the ponderous pomposity and violence of empire. Such reading of the Easter Rising as a strike against imperial oppression is evident too in her holograph account of a visit to Dublin in the aftermath of the Rising, which she wrote after she had rushed to Dublin to visit her sisters I have described at Mountjoy Prison. This is what she wrote. As the Leinster steamed into Dublin Bay on that May morning of 1916, the world seemed transfigured with beauty and delight. The sea shifted and glittered and dreamed. It was hardly possible to believe that any man could look upon the vessel's shining track merely as the road to empire and domination. Yet as the siren suddenly shrieked out its harsh warning, the sight of a great mass of khaki-clad soldiers crowding round the gangway shook the glamour of the scene and brought queer memories of past generations. Soldiers of all times, of the same nationality, and on the same quest. Soldiers in the queer, bulky armour of the Middle Ages, soldiers in the gay colours of the Elizabethans, soldiers in Cromwell's drabs, soldiers in the stiff reds of the last century, and now soldiers in khaki. 10 minutes after that, the world turned black as I read the words that shrieked in huge letters from every hoarding in the town. James Connolly shot this morning. Eva Gore Booth was deeply shaken by the execution of James Connolly, whom she had met together with Jim Larkin during her visits to Dublin. She especially liked and admired Connolly, a man of whom she wrote, had that quality rare indeed among politicians, that however absorbed he might be in fighting for a cause, he did not forget to answer the appeal of individual suffering. She also shared Connolly's Irish Citizen Army's version of radical social reform, which included equality between the sexes as one of its central goals. And indeed, the participation of the Citizen Army in the Rising of 1916 is a clear example of equality between the sexes. Eva thus lost several of her friends in the Easter Rising, not just James Connolly, but also her very dear friend, Frances Sheehy Skeffington, suffragist, activist, and pacifist, who was summarily executed by British soldiers on the third day of the Rising, although he did not have any part in the fighting. The murder of Frances Sheehy Skeffington was seen by Eva Gore Booth as emblematic of the brutal spirit of militarism. As she put it, in Sheehy Skeffington, militarism has struck down its worst enemy, unarmed yet insurgent idealism. During their visits to Dublin, Eva and Esther stayed with Constance Markievicz often at her Surrey house in Rathmines, and it was in this house that Larkin had in August 1913, seeking to evade arrest, lodged, and the Workers' Republic founded by Connolly was printed at that address for a while. Upon her return to London from Dublin in the early summer of 1916, Eva Gore Booth also passionately dedicated herself to the campaign for the reprieve of Sir Roger Casement, who had been arrested on Bannastrand, a beach off Ireland's west coast, in a failed attempt to ship weapons to the Irish volunteers and really to advise against the Rising because the arms had been lost. The subsequent years of Eva Gore Booth's life were punctuated by visits to her sister in various prisons, not just Mountjoy and then Aylesbury Prison in Buckinghamshire, where Constance Markievicz was held until June 1917, but also Holloway Jail, where she herself was imprisoned in 1918 and 1919, alongside Maud Gonne and Kathleen Clarke, after the British Intelligence Service had claimed to have uncovered a Sinn Féin German plot. Eva's familiarisation with the world of prisons, which she described as all the same, built after the same dreary pattern, very imposing and grand on the outside, they gradually get squallider and squallider the further you get into them. This led her to espouse then yet another cause, that of prison reform, which she championed alongside her campaign for the abolition of the death penalty throughout the years of the Irish War of Independence. Sinn Féin's victory in the December 1918 general election made of her sister Markievicz the first woman ever elected to the British House of Commons. Markievicz received a letter from Lloyd George at Holloway Prison, inviting her to the House of Commons for the opening day of the sessions, and greatly enjoyed replying to it. Dear friends, I have to tell you as I finish that it was on a visit to my friend Peter O'Toole's house, Guyan House in Heath Street in Hampstead, that I found a flyer inside the front door asking local members of the Labour Party to assemble the following Saturday for their Saturday activity to clear up Eva Gore Booth's grave. And that stirred my interest in Constance Markievicz's neglected sister. And I believe it would be such a travesty, it seemed to me, to continue to neglect Eva Gore Booth's life and work, her contribution to women, her contribution to men, to socialism, to equality, to feminism. That is why we are all so indebted to Dr. Sonia Tiernan and those like her, who have in fact restored her in history. Eva Gore Booth's extraordinary path of engagement is one that remains deeply inspiring to all of us today. She was not limited by any sectional views. She was never sectarian, dismissive, or excluding. She was driven by an uncompromising ethical consciousness of the universality of human rights. She was a woman who felt compelled to engage with injustices wherever she found them, possessed as she was by a deep ethical concern for the value of each human life, for everything that makes human life worth living: solidarity, freedom, construction, joy and love, and the courage to love where she found it. And indeed it was words of love, those of the ancient Greek poetess Sappho, that Eva Gore Booth and Esther Roper chose to be inscribed on the grave that they share at St. John's Churchyard, where they lie together. And what is written on that stone is, "Life that is love is God." Goramila Mahaki, thank you.